This is the first video in a series designed to inform technologists about radiation protection. The purpose of this video series is to examine best practices in radiation safety. We will briefly look at the biological effects of radiation on the human body to further drive home the potential risk of radiation. We will review the role of the radiographer in creating an environment of safety for ourselves, patients, and others in the vicinity of radiation-producing equipment and radiopharmaceuticals. And lastly, a main goal of this series is to establish a balanced perspective of risk for occupational radiation workers and their patients. In this first introductory video, we will explore the early history of radiation and radiation protection. We will talk about where our information comes from about the effects of radiation. We will take a look at sources of radiation. And lastly, we will review the types of radiation. A comprehensive discussion about radiation protection isn't complete without providing some historical perspective. It is often thought that early pioneers of the radiologic sciences did not understand the consequences of exposure to radiation, and this simply is not true. Shortly after the accidental discovery of X-rays in 1895 by Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, it was determined that radiation posed a health risk. Röntgen himself used lead shielding in his experiments to protect himself from the effects. Early on, those working with X-ray radiation did not have devices to quantify the radiation output of X-ray tubes. The earliest mechanism to calibrate X-ray tubes was holding a hand in front of the tube to adjust the voltage. In 1896, the same year that natural radiation was discovered by Antoine Henry Becquerel and the fluoroscope was invented by Thomas Edison, a paper was published documenting a severe case of dermatitis caused by radiation. In October of 1900, Dr. Myron Kasabian published his experiences working with radiation titled X-ray as an Irritant, where he discussed the effects of radiation on his hands. He mostly utilized fluoroscopy and would hold his hand in front of the fluoroscope to ease the anxiety and stress of patients undergoing a procedure involving the new technology. This led to redness, swelling, and a glossy yellow discoloration of the skin. He continued to work with radiation and authored a book about radiological practices. Dr. Kasabian is also credited with creating the first rules of radiation protection. Unfortunately, he died in 1910 as a result of his radiation exposure, but he was not the first documented casualty of radiation. That unfortunate honor goes to Clarence Daly, a young glassblower and assistant to Thomas Edison. Mr. Daly was the test subject and assistant for the invention of Edison's fluoroscope. He also experienced lesions on his hand and underwent many operative procedures to remove skin, fingers, and eventually his right arm, but nonetheless he succumbed to his radiation injuries at the age of 39 in the year of 1904. Edison ceased all radiation experiments due to the potential risk after seeing the effects on his assistant. As a result of these deaths and others, in 1915 the British Röntgen Society resolved to protect people from overexposure to X-rays. It wasn't the first attempt to impose radiation safety standards. In fact, back in 1902, the first dose limit was suggested at approximately 10 rad per day. By 1903, radiosensitive organs were identified. In the 1920s and 30s, radiation safety progressed and continued to be refined over the next decades into the safety standards and monitoring practices that are in place today, making the field of medical imaging a safe working environment. Those that suffered the consequences of radiation exposure gave the scientific community information about the biological effects of radiation as well as leverage to make changes. Much was learned from those early experiences. Unfortunately, much of what is currently known about the price of radiation exposure is from tragedy and disasters. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, a precursor to the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, tracked the long-term health effects of survivors of the 1945 atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Nuclear accidents, such as the 1979 Three Mile Island incident in Middletown, Pennsylvania, and the 1986 Chernobyl meltdown in the Ukraine also gave scientists statistical data that led to the determination of radiation thresholds in place today. Exposure limitation is an essential part of radiation protection, and while we can't perform radiation experimentation on human subjects, we can glean information from those that have been unfortunate to encounter radiation quantities that induced biological effects. Now that you've been thoroughly terrified of radiation, let me talk you down. Radiation is all around us. Okay, probably not helping. Let me try this again. Radiation is natural and in small amounts is safe. There are two main types of radiation, natural and man-made. Natural radiation, which makes up a majority of the background radiation, comes from a variety of sources that we will further break down into three basic categories. Some radiation comes from outer space. It's referred to as cosmic radiation, and majority of it comes from our own sun. The good news is that the Earth's magnetic field, as well as the atmosphere, protects us from most of the cosmic radiation. However, those living at higher altitudes have less atmosphere protecting them, and they receive higher doses as a result. The same is true for travel on airplanes. Terrestrial radiation comes from the radioactive minerals in the ground and groundwater. Some areas have higher concentrations of radioactive minerals than others, and so as with cosmic radiation, where you live may play a role in your annual dose from terrestrial radiation. Radon gas is the biggest culprit of terrestrial radiation exposure. It can seep through the foundations of your home, collecting within the structure and exposing those that live there to the radioactive gas. The last natural radiation type that we will cover is internal radiation. You may be surprised to know that you are a source of radiation. Minerals such as potassium-40 and strontium-90 are found in the human body and make up a small percentage of your annual dose of radiation. Now let's backtrack and look at man-made sources of radiation. In this video, I will generally break man-made sources into three categories. The first is medical radiation, such as X-rays, computed tomography, nuclear medicine studies, and positron emission tomography, or PET scans. Consumer products and technology are another source of man-made radiation. You might not be aware, but the glossy magazines, smoke detectors, enameled jewelry, fertilizers, and even bananas give off small amounts of radiation. Another source of man-made radiation is cigarettes. I don't want to sound like an after-school special, but it's interesting to note that radioactive particulates from smoking are inhaled and remain in the lungs, continuing to expose the smoker with alpha radiation for the rest of that person's life. This category also includes those that work with radiation or radiation-producing products. And the last source we will discuss is from building materials, such as brick and marble. Living or working in such buildings adds to one's annual dose. So let's break down the dose for an average American in 1 year's time. First, we will look at the natural background radiation that we receive. Now remember that these percentages can vary greatly depending on where you live. Sorry, Denver. Radon and thoron gas make up a large portion of the background radiation at 228 millirem per year. This is the category that has the most variance. Some regions have little to no radon gas, while others have very high accumulations. Another source of natural background radiation is cosmic radiation. We receive about 33 millirem each year from this source. We also receive about 21 millirem from terrestrial sources. And the last source of natural background radiation is 29 millirem of internal radiation received annually. Now let's factor in man-made radiation and look at the annual amounts that we receive on average. Medical radiation makes up the highest source of radiation, accounting for 300 millirem. This category can be broken down further into various modalities that utilize radiation, with computed tomography being the largest source of medical radiation. Lastly, we combine consumer radiation and building sources of radiation, and together they make up 13.3 millirem of dose. The total annual radiation dose for someone living in the United States is approximately 620 millirem. And as I stated earlier, this can vary depending on where you live and also based on your occupation. Another factor is your age and health. Individuals that require more imaging procedures involving radiation will have a higher annual dose. Now that we have a basic understanding of the history of radiation protection for at least the first 20 years, and we understand where our potential radiation risk is coming from, I want to briefly introduce you to different types of radiation. Radiation can be broken into three types: waves and media, such as sound, electromagnetic waves, such as gamma rays and X-rays, and particulate radiation, such as alpha and beta particles. You may find it interesting to know that gamma rays, alpha particles, and beta particles are naturally occurring, while X-rays are man-made. For this discussion, we will only talk about ionizing radiation, which includes electromagnetic waves and particulate radiation. Both gamma rays and X-rays are electromagnetic waves that are found on the electromagnetic spectrum. Neither possess mass or a charge. Both are able to penetrate human tissue, with gamma radiation having a greater ability to penetrate than X-rays. Only 1 to 2% of X-rays penetrate the body, while with gamma radiation, up to 10% can pass through the body. Particulate radiation can pose a greater risk of harm than the electromagnetic radiation we just reviewed. Alpha particles are positively charged. They're large and have a mass of 8,000 times greater than an electron. Because of this, they can't penetrate much and only reach about 1 millimeter into human tissue. But that small amount of depth creates havoc as alpha particles cause multiple ionizations. External alpha radiation affects the skin, while cigarette smoking gives alpha particles entrance into the respiratory system and access to lung tissues. Beta particles are smaller and can penetrate further than alpha particles, but not by much. They reach roughly 2 centimeters into human tissue. Beta particles are negatively charged and ionize atoms by repelling electrons right out of their orbital shells. Particulate radiation is more damaging in general due to the concentration of that damage to a smaller volume of tissue. Radiation is part of our everyday lives, even if we didn't choose a career involving medical radiation. Natural background radiation, as well as man-made sources of radiation, expose us to approximately 620 millirem each year. Having an occupation working with radiation will increase your annual exposure. On average, a radiographer doubles their background radiation dose. To put this into perspective, living for 1 year exposes an average person to the same amount of radiation as a single abdominal radiograph. Working as a radiographer increases the radiation exposure equal to that of 2 abdominal radiographs. However, as educated and responsible professionals, the use of time, distance, and shielding can keep our exposures minimal. As technologists, we are required to follow the ALARA principle, as low as reasonably achievable, meaning that we strive to provide the safest environment for ourselves, those we work with, and those we care for in our profession by keeping radiation exposure as low as possible. I hope you have found this introductory video helpful. Stay tuned for the next video where we will further investigate units of measurement for radiation exposure, bringing perspective to our risk and others to medical radiation.